management risk. He has a title of Juris Doctor at Suffolk University Law School, a master's degree at Lindenwood University, and a college at Bates College. He has also a license for Series 7. Michael, it's a real pleasure to us to have you here, and all my students are amazing to this opportunity to have you here and to listen to your lessons. It's really a pleasure. Please feel free to start your presentation.
Well, thank you very much, Dalton. If anybody has trouble hearing me, please let me know. Or if there's something you'd like me to repeat, I'm happy to do so. I'm going to share my screen on here so that I will use a slideshow as a guide here. If I can call this up. There we go.
Yes.
All right. All right. Well, once again, thank you very much. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you. As Dalton mentioned, I do have very lengthy experience in the financial services industry in the United States. And I think it's given me a fairly solid basis for understanding the importance of compliance. I chose today to talk about what we call the 7 kind of fundamental principles of compliance. I'm sure you've talked about these in some form or another. You can find, different approaches. Some people say 6 characteristics, 7 characteristics. That's not as much the point as I think it's important to remember where these characteristics come from, and to remember that we have to approach them with caution, because if we focus just on the characteristics themselves, we lose the meaning of what they're intended to accomplish. So with that background, I thought today I would talk about first, what does effective mean? We talk about effective compliance. It's no longer just compliance. We'll give some meaning to that.
Michael, we are not hearing you anymore. Okay.
Le travou, será?
Uhum. Sim. No, now you're back.
Okay, I'm sorry, I don't know what happened there. So let me share the screen again. I noticed that the box had disappeared, so my apologies. But so we'll talk about characteristics, what they mean, and then move to a discussion, hopefully a discussion amongst you. Looking at Enron, which again, I'm sure you've talked about, and the lessons learned from Enron, which many think is the beginning of the modern era of compliance. So what's this notion of effective compliance? We no longer speak only of having a compliance program, but we qualify our programs as effective. In the United States, in specific applications, so for example, the SEC, we have rules that talk about effective compliance. In the banking space, our banking regulators talk about effective compliance programs. And I think the measure for this, or the reason for this, I should say, is that we're not just talking about the importance of having something, but we're talking about the importance of having something that achieves specified objectives. So we need to know what those objectives are in order to determine if our programs are effective. Does this help or hurt the compliance practitioner? In my opinion, I think it helps us. And it helps us in several ways. First and foremost, it requires that we articulate the objectives we have. Why are we doing something? What's the importance of what we're doing? And particularly or specifically, what is the outcome we're looking for? So, we've heard this notion of outcomes-based, management. Well, this is one way that we can take our compliance programs and determine the outcomes ahead of time and then measure whether we are successful or not on that basis. Now, in my view, the effective compliance program mantra is the result of this progression in the modern compliance era because of problems we've had. These problems are worldwide. We've heard of the London whale, trading at a bank, financial services organization in London. Société Générale, the French bank, had a problem. Here in the US, there are three that I would point to. The Caremark case is really, probably the beginning of the real beginning of our modern compliance era, where it was recognized in the court system that boards of directors have a specific compliance responsibility. Now it's oversight, but they have to have that, oversight in an effective way, so that management is not just doing what it does without the board overseeing it. Following Caremark, Enron, was, as we all know, a very major mark, I think, on us and on the management of effective companies in so many ways. One of the most important ways, one of the most important characteristics I see in this is the ethical aspects of what Enron stands for. And we'll talk a little about this at the end. And I hope that becomes the basis for. So just to know, Enron was a situation where an energy company in the United States had moved into, it had grown pretty quickly, was a darling of the stock market, and moved into some pretty complicated financial transactions. And those resulted in some accounting practices that it turns out, were hiding effectively from the employee, not from the employees, but from shareholders of the company and from regulators, what was going on behind the scenes. So ethical issues, at the core of Enron. And then another one is Madoff. And I mentioned Madoff not as much because of what it means for the company and what it means for the board of directors, as Caremark and Enron do, but what it means from a regulator standpoint. Madoff happened under, the oversight of the regulators in the United States. They had investigated, as they typically do. They do these exams. They never detected a problem at Madoff, and I think that has sensitized regulators to focus on this notion of effective compliance. Don't put the burden on the regulator to determine whether or not a company is doing what it should do. Make sure the company understands it has that burden on its own. The company must make these determinations about what is effective and be able to demonstrate that it is following what is needed in order to have effective compliance programs. That ties into responsibilities of various parties, but importantly, chief compliance officers, have ultimate responsibility in this regard. So that leads us to these 7 characteristics of an effective compliance program. What I've listed here, something I found online, it's kind of a combination of a few different approaches, but generally speaking, these are characteristics that are seen and understood to be important by most practitioners, certainly everybody I know. So I'll go through them really quickly. I don't know that, and I assume you don't need a whole lot of discussion on these points. I may pause on a couple of them, though, to emphasize certain aspects. So written policies and procedures. These are, cornerstones of compliance programs. Taking time to write down statements of policy and expectations by way of procedures for all members of a corporate entity. Ensuring that there's good governance, that is brought together under these policies and procedures. But in a sense, it's the contract, it's the document that says we are taking this seriously. Here's what we do. Second, designation of compliance officer and compliance committee. Again, pretty straightforward, but you have somebody responsible, compliance officer, and you have a committee. It doesn't have to be a compliance committee, but there's a governance aspect that is formalized by way of charter. Effective training and education, that's an expectation, especially in highly complex and highly regulated areas, to ensure that the employee base understands their responsibilities. I liken it to some arcane laws, in the United States, where if you're not told about these laws, you won't necessarily know about them. We all know when we're driving on the highway what the speed limit is because there's a sign. When I walk into my office in the morning, though, there's not a sign that says you must, follow the following rules or do the following things. Education works in conjunction with these other things to do that. Effective lines of communication, I think that speaks for itself. There has to be a willingness to communicate among all levels of the company, and that expectation has to translate to a mechanism for problems to be surfaced. There's a specific, issue that arose in Enron as organizations where employees didn't feel that they could communicate. In the Enron case, somebody sent one of the vice president level employees sent an anonymous letter to point out what he thought was inappropriate accounting practice. There was no mechanism for this person to do it, but fortunately, he had enough ethical commitment to decide what to do himself. Monitoring, internal monitoring and auditing, obviously ensuring that there is an acceptable way to monitor what is going on. We can't really conclude that something is effective if we aren't monitoring the expected results to ensure they conform with expectations. Enforcement of standards through well-publicized disciplinary guidelines. This gets to the core of ensuring that we're applying rules consistently. We're not creating a set of rules that senior people have to follow that are easier or less cumbersome than what the junior people have to follow. Everybody has to follow the same rules, and we have to apply them consistently and without pressure, to exempt certain people because of their positions. And then finally, prompt response to problems through corrective actions. Every company has problems. We all do, we always will. So it's not a question of saying, well, we want to ensure that we never have problems. The objective is ensure that if you have problems, you can identify them quickly and you can, take a corporate or make a corporate commitment to solve the problems through corrective action. So these are the characteristics of an effective compliance program. In some ways, I've seen people who actually look at these as a checklist. If I'm going to create, a compliance program, I come up with policies and procedures, check that, I've done it. I have a compliance officer committee, we have regular meetings, check that. We do training. We tell everybody, we have a line of communication. We check the box on each one and look at it as if it is something to be done and move on to the next thing. That to me is the challenge. So it's very tempting and it's easy for an organization to view these really as check the box activities, kind of like a project plan where we set different work streams and we complete those work streams and then move on to something else. I think it's easy for several reasons. One, they involve people from different levels and at different times and activities, right? We have some senior people, we've got junior people, we can have the junior people doing certain things, senior people doing other things. Business people may feel that, these things are really not priority for me, so I don't quote unquote own them the way the other people should or somebody else may. And then probably most importantly, the one that I've seen most frequently is this idea that it's compliance's responsibility to do this. So it's a challenge, not just in for these reasons in the approach to saying, oh, there are 6 or 7 key behaviors that we want to look for to ensure that we're effective. But one of those behaviors says we have a compliance officer who's responsible for this, and that creates an incentive for people to say, oh, it's the compliance officer's responsibility, it's not my responsibility. So, this challenge is something that I think we have to take into account as we are looking at building compliance programs and maintaining compliance programs. But in many ways, it also helps us understand what it means to have an effective compliance program. An effective compliance program is not one that looks at these activities as check the box activities. Instead, the effective compliance program is one that must look at them in an integrated way. I'm going to go back on my slide. If we look at written policies and procedures as a, kind of a separate exercise from, for example, effective lines of communication, we may not build into those policies and procedures those effective lines of communication. Likewise, if our policies and procedures don't address, the final bullet here, prompt response to problems through corrective actions, if they don't lay out what that response would look like, if they don't set the future game plan, at least for formatting of how we would approach things, then this holistically would not be important. If internal monitoring and auditing and the results of those activities are not then factored in when we do a review of policies and procedures, we will not be able to maintain the program in a continuous growth mode, right? We would run the risk of saying, well, we've created policies and procedures and now they are set in time. We need to have a living, dynamic program, and we need to view as a result, or maybe in order to achieve that objective, we need to view all of these activities as interrelated and as part of a single broader objective, which is the maintenance of an effective compliance program. So what do we need to do to ensure that we don't fall into the trap that I've mentioned here? Well, the solution may seem, my proposed solution here may seem pretty straightforward and pretty simple, but it's getting at what I think is the most important element for an effective compliance program, and that's cultivating an ethical culture. A business organization brings together people from different backgrounds. In our global world, we have people from different cultures. We also have people who aren't in the same physical location and sometimes may never be in the same physical location. Like us, they may be virtual. So we need to understand the characteristics of our company and adapt our goals and objectives to ensure that we understand what that means, what these characteristics mean, and the challenges they may create in order for us to cultivate an ethical culture. Top-down messaging is a really important point here. And that is really intended to say that this is not coming from the compliance department. It needs to start at the top of an organization. And typically there's going to be a board of directors, of some sort, executive leadership, and then the employee base. The messaging has to be given from the top down, and it must be reiterated throughout, time. The messaging, though, can't be limited to just words. There need to be actions, behind the words. So steps taken, for example, by key business people, chief executive officers, for example, anything they can do to demonstrate that this is important. We have established, this ethical culture as a corporate strategic objective. And we will hold people accountable if they don't support us in that sense, are all important aspects of taking those words and ensuring that they can be converted to action. And then education, clearly an important point. But education should not be limited to telling people what they shouldn't do, or telling people what they recent changes to regulations, or here's a quick summary of what's in our policies and procedures. I think education needs to be constructed in a way that it learns from the past, highlights where there may be changes, and we all evolve our programs. We start with something, we make changes. There are reasons for those changes. Let's be open with our people and honest with them so they understand why we're making the changes. And then, we treat them as true owners in these processes so that it's less than, or it's more than just another training exercise where they are listening to us and, spending an hour on this training and then moving on to something else. It needs to be practical. It needs to show them the importance of what an ethical culture means and is, but it also has to give them tools to guide their own decision making. And I think in that process, it makes everybody accountable for the solution. So those are my general comments. Now, I wanted to move to a discussion, and Enron is kind of the springboard for the discussion. And I chose Enron for a couple of reasons. One, it's very well known. And as I said, I think in many ways we can point to regulatory responses to Enron as the beginning of contemporary compliance program management. In the United States, we had the Sarbanes-Oxley Act enacted shortly afterwards. Another reason I chose it is last year, I think we celebrated the 20th anniversary of the start of its downfall. And that was opportunity for some observations, which I'm happy to send to you if you don't have them. Harvard Law School Forum on Corporate Governance had posted a few blog style posts, where they look at the lasting lessons of Enron. And I think, there's some really interesting observations that come from that. And I'd like to use, some of these just as kind of springboards here. So, in one, the critical importance of board oversight is reiterated. In my experience, that is pretty well embedded now in our corporate cultures here in the United States and globally, in my experience. It may take on different meaning, but I think there's a general understanding that boards have to have a role. What isn't always clear is what that means beyond, the periodic discussion. How involved should the board be? How much reporting should they get? These are all things that, still, I think, boards grapple with. Another important point that's raised in one of these blogs is this notion of spotting red flags. It's easy for us today, given all the material available to us, to read about what happened at Enron and to be able to say, oh, there was a problem here, we see it clearly. There was a problem here, we see it clearly. But I think what it tells us is when you look at what happened at the time, it would seem that there were not generally understood processes for how you deal with red flags. And just in case red flags aren't clear, that's a term we use to identify something that doesn't look right. It's sending a message to us that it's unusual, it's indicative potentially of a problem. So that notion of red flags, I think, is an important one. Now, a lot has taken place since Enron in this space, and I think we have many ways that have shown themselves to be effective. An important one being the whole notion around whistleblowers and protections given to whistleblowers, actually encouragements in some cases, where whistleblowers are rewarded potentially for financially if they bring to the regulators' attention some of these red flags. But it's an important concept that I think still has to be taken into account. And then, one other notion that came through, and this really was something that was written about by Professor Craig Johnson in 2003, and it's this whole notion of morality and ethics. We can have specific rules and regulations, and they are good, but they alone do not make for a moral framework for a company. There are people, individuals, and those individuals are always going to be responsible for decision making. So one of the greatest challenges, for us in our compliance programs is ensuring that we're conveying that, commitment to morality, knowing that we can't frame the individual and how the individual responds, and that starts at the top of the organization all the way down. But we do need a structure that ensures that problems can be identified and that resolutions can be worked out by the people that ought to be doing that, which typically, would tie back to the board of directors. So I will pause here and first ask, does anybody have any questions that I can answer? And if not, I'm open to observations and would love to hear if anybody disagrees with anything I said. That would be a good starting point. We can have a discussion there.
Alguém tem alguma pergunta, pessoal? Marcelo, Júlia? I'm asking if they have some question for you, Michael, in Portuguese.
Okay. Yes. And if I said something that people don't understand, I'm happy to try to explain again.
Ok. Pessoal, ficou alguma dúvida sobre o que ele falou? Ou vocês discordam? Júlia? Okay, I think I have a question, Michael, from Marcelo Busco. Marcelo, pode falar. You can ask your question to Michael.
Good evening, Professor. Thank you very much for sharing all your knowledge with us tonight. Professor, I have a question. It's more a kind of a curiosity about the compliance in the United States. As the question is a little long and maybe difficult for me to understand in English, I wrote it down here and I'm going to read it for you, okay? Professor, in the matter concerning to companies' self-regulation, taking into account that states have its own laws in the US, isn't it difficult for companies to comply with the rules in the different states of the Federation?
So, Marcel, I think I'm having can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Oh,
we can hear.
Okay.
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, so I think just to repeat your question to be sure I understand, is it difficult
Right.
in the United States for companies to comply because we have federal laws and state laws?
Yes, that's it.
Yes. So I think there are some industries where it will be more complicated. Industries well, I'll use this example. It's not my area of expertise, but it seems to me one of the challenges for car manufacturers today in the United States is we have federal guidelines for emissions, but now we have states trying to enact laws and rules that are more restrictive than the federal. So that would make it very difficult, right? If you're manufacturing a car in a, that in theory should be able to be sold anywhere in the United States, you may have to manufacture that car in accordance with the standards of the most stringent regulator. So I do think there are examples where it can be very challenging, and in that case, it's challenging from an economic and a business standpoint, right? I mean, you can't manufacture cars, with at scale if you have to make this one comply with California standards, this one comply with Massachusetts, and this one everywhere else. It just it would cost a lot of money to buy a car. So that's not workable. For the most part, though, I think in the United States, we have at the federal level taken responsibility for articulating the standards that should apply across the country. And I'll point to financial services regulation, banks, brokerage firms, investment advisors. I think pharmaceutical companies, we have some pretty high federal standards. And I think there are many other areas like that where at the federal level, we have a standard. So that makes it easier for companies to comply. That said, it is a challenge for smaller companies. So for example, in the investment management world, you don't have to register with the Securities and Exchange Commission if you are a small investment management firm only doing business in one state. But that
thank you, Professor.
Yeah. You're welcome.
Alguém tem mais perguntas para o professor Michael? Não. Lídia, alguma pergunta do YouTube?
Nenhuma pergunta no YouTube, professor.
Well, Michael, nobody has questions anymore for you, but I have some questions. So let me think. Yeah. Michael, in your opinion, how has the role of the compliance function shifted since the Enron case?
I'm sorry, Dalton, I didn't, how has the
role of the compliance officer changed since the Enron case?
Well, I think it has changed in some very important ways. First, the importance of the chief compliance officer role, or of any compliance role, I think has been increased. People understand that it is an important role, and regulators expect people in the role to have authority, to have stature, and to be able to bring about change in the company. So that's one positive that makes the job easier. The negative side is that regulators are focusing on people responsible, and that includes compliance officers. So there's a personal liability side to this that I think has arisen in the post-Enron world that is a challenge. There is a case in the United States where BlackRock Investment Management had some issues, and the chief compliance officer of BlackRock had to pay a fine to the SEC for failure to do certain things that the SEC expected. That person cannot get a job in the industry now. So, it's one example, but I think it shows that, showing two sides of this. On the one hand, post-Enron, we are recognized as being important. On the other hand, regulators are also trying to hold us liable, which I think is a mistake. I can only do what the company allows me to do. If the chief executive officer says no, I can't do it. I may have authority to talk to the board of directors. I may be able to call a whistleblower line, but I pretty much am running the risk that I will lose my job. So it's a challenge. I think the liability aspect, I want to be clear, is it doesn't come into play frequently, but it is something that I know all of my colleagues are concerned about. If regulators globally start moving in that direction, then we would have it would be hard to find people who would be willing to take on responsibility.
Thank you, Michael. I have another question for you. How can the compliance function become more effective in combating risk, in your opinion?
Well, I think, first, I think it's a great question because compliance is, it's risk. It's all about risk. I think, though, one of the challenges we have on the compliance side is helping the business to make those risk decisions, right? We shouldn't be making risk decisions. The business should be making risk decisions. We can advise, and we may need to say, if we know something cannot be done, then we have to say, you cannot do this, right? If it is illegal to do something, we have to tell people you can't do it. There's no negotiation there. But a lot of what we do is in what we call the gray area. So you can't do this, you can do that. We're doing something that's in between, and we must decide, is it permissible or is it not? And that's where I end up trying to ensure that I'm helping business people balance that risk, understand the risk, but know that they will be accountable for making the decision. Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does. My final question for you, Michael. What role does technology plays in your job? How technology change your actuation as a chief compliance officer?
Well, technology has been the focus of many compliance programs and compliance officers, I'd say, for the last 10 years. And I'll explain why, at least in the in my business, in the financial services business. The reason in my business it's become a focus is what has happened at the Securities and Exchange Commission. Securities and Exchange Commission now receives boatloads of data. They get data files, they process those files on their own. We have to be able to understand the data we're giving them, right? If we're giving them data that says there's a problem, we should know that ourselves. So companies have had to focus on, it's one thing, you know, the SEC says, give us the data. Oh, we give a data feed. Here you go, here's the data. But what's in the data? So, you know, companies have focused on ensuring that they have appropriate data management systems and data monitoring systems to be able to interpret the data. I mentioned earlier the red flags. Well, data often can include red flags, right? Data can include a data point that is a problem. So somebody did something they weren't supposed to do, and it's in the data. Or it may be a trending sort of, you know, monitor where you look and, you know, we look, for example, at what we call code of ethics violations. We have a code of ethics that requires personal trading activity of our employees to be monitored. So if they're purchasing and selling securities on the stock exchange, we monitor that. They have to get our pre-approval, and then they have to follow certain rules with regard to it. We monitor when they, yes, we have this happen frequently, somebody forgets to get pre-approval. So we monitor those statistics. Like, you know, this month we had 12, you know, next month we have 24, you know, now we're on an upward trend, and then we monitor and report to our board of directors on the mutual fund side, you know, for monitoring of the trend. So the short answer to your question is data has become very important. It's become important in large part because our regulators now have data management organizations, you know, that they parse through data themselves and understand it better than we could, and we need to be able to do the same in what we do.
Thank you, Michael. Julia has a question for you now.
Thank you, Dalton. Hello, Michael. Thank you so much for your lesson. In your opinion, compliance works in metaverse?
Compliance works. I'm sorry, I didn't get the last part.
Metaverse. It's something new.
No, I have my computer I keep cutting out. So could you repeat the question? My apologies.
Yeah, no problem. In your opinion, compliance works in metaverse?
Yes. I think compliance, I think, needs to work in sort of a metaverse, because the people companies employ, you know, are in in metaverses all over the place. So, you know, we cannot look at what we do with narrow vision. We must look at where our employees are, where our companies are. You know, we are across the globe, and people are acting internationally. And, you know, I think one of the big challenges is what's going on. And this is, you know, I assume I'm talking properly here about metaverse. One challenge we have today is communication technology. There are, you know, we all have our phones. We can communicate on our phones outside the normal means of communication from work. And in the United States, our regulators have started to focus on that, where they may be, employees may be engaging in discussions with other outside organizations using apps like WhatsApp, which can't be monitored. So, you know, these are very current topics I don't profess to have an answer to them because on the one hand, I think those applications are good. On the other hand, the regulator is telling us we are responsible for employees who use them, but we have policies that tell employees they can't use them. So, we don't know if they're using them. So it's a very challenging time, but, I think these big picture questions are definitely questions we have to develop answers to, as the world becomes more complex. Very good question. Thank you.
Thank you, Julia. Alguém tem mais alguma questão, professor Michael? Lídia, alguma outra pergunta no YouTube?
Tem perguntas, professor.
Michael, I think that's it. Thank you very much for your time and for that presentation, which was enlightening. I learned a lot from you, and I hope to see you soon in another presentation that we have on this September.
Thank you very much, Duncan, and thank you all. I appreciate your attention, and if you have any questions or if there's anything I can provide to you, please feel free to reach out. All right.
Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you.